Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome again to the Sunday Speaker Series. Welcome also to those on Zoom. We're hoping that you have a slightly better experience than last time. We know you didn't have a lot of sound initially, but please let us know right away in the chat box if you have any problems, or raise your hand and we'll hopefully identify it right away and get onto it. So please let us know. It's with great appreciation that we, the residents of Protection Island, acknowledge this land as the unceded territory of the Nanaimo First Nation and their legacy throughout the island. Thank yous, first of all, to Peter for setting up the chairs and making the coffee, for Emily and the guides and members for helping. There they are. Thanks, guys. They're helping serving. Emily again for Zoom setup, which is so good. Donations this week will go to the guides. A little bit of housekeeping. This talk is being recorded if you need to watch it again. Just one washroom today. Questions will be at the end of the talk. Zoomers, use the chat box, please, or raise your hand so we can see it. And please mute yourself until the end. Thank you very much. Now the moment we're waiting for. Our speaker today is Jane Watson, a longtime resident of PI, and whom many of us know along with their partner, Graham. Where's Graham? Okay. Although Jane was raised in Vancouver, she tells me she did a lot of camping on Newcastle as a child, and they used to walk across at low tide to buy ice cream treats at Lee Shore. That's so fun to me. And often came ashore right where their house is today. Jane did her undergraduate work at UBC, spent a few years working as a marine biologist, and then did a PhD at the University of California at Santa Cruz. And that's how Jane became interested in sea otters, possibly a little before that, I'm not sure about that, as a PhD research project. She tells me that they're the forgotten predator. They eat a lot and they change the way coastal ecosystems look. Next, Jane taught at VIU in the biology department until 2016, where she was primarily a vertebrate ecologist. Today, she's a professor emeritus at VIU. Jane moved to Protection Island in 1989. Graham and Jane have 2 grown children. Please welcome Jane Watson.
Okay, so today I'm going to talk about sea otters, but what you guys don't know is actually the hotbed of sea otter research in British Columbia. It probably would make run for a hotbed of sea otter research in Canada, actually, because all of those people there have strong affiliations with Protection Islands. Linda Nicol, her mother Christina, lives on the island here, so you see Linda around a lot. Erin Foster, her husband Matt, and their little boy Levi tried desperately to buy a house on Protection Island, but unfortunately chose that exact wrong period of time. But they have house sat for us so many times, you guys would recognize them if you saw them wandering around. Ed Greger from UBC has just completed a PhD on sea otters as well as Erin. And he has just brought property on Protection Island because he has house sat for us for years as well. And then last but not least, you all know Michael Hawkslaw. Michael wouldn't like to admit it, but he's actually done some work by affiliations on sea otters. So I'm going to talk about all of their work as well. So I'm going to talk about sea otters, but I actually need to talk about history first. So when Europeans first arrived on the west coast of what we now call North America and British Columbia, they encountered a very, very sophisticated, extremely well-versed in sharing and trading sea otter pelts. And okay, so with the arrival of Europeans on the west coast of Vancouver Island, the west coast of North America, a large-scale commercial trade for sea otters started up. And I brought the sea otter pelt to show you guys why there was such a rush to trade in this. It was known as soft gold. It was worth a king's ransom for trade in China. So European traders arrived on the west coast of what is now North America, traded with the First Nations people that were here, as well as hunted for sea otters themselves. And we will never know exactly how many sea otters are on the west coast, But they landed during the fur trade, which went from 1792 to about 1850. They landed over 50,000 sea otters. Some of those would have been traded from pelts that were in hand by the people that were here, but many certainly would have been hunted. By 1850, the pelts were incredibly rare. It was hard to find a sea otter. But they had become so valuable that spending months and months and months to find a single animal that would bring you almost an entire lifetime's income was worth it. So by 1911, sea otters were finally protected under a treaty that was meant to protect fur seals, but protected incidentally sea otters. And by 1929, the last sea otter that we know of in British Columbia was dead. That was it. Sea otters were gone. Not quite though, because the Atomic Energy Commission of the United States started testing nuclear devices at Vancouver Island. And this was home to some of the 2,000 remaining sea otters globally. And so to try and mitigate the effects of that atomic energy test, which was literally going to kill otters, they relocated otters to portions of their historic range. And one of those areas selected was the west coast of Vancouver Island, a place called Chequasit Bay. So from 1969 to 1972, 89 sea otters, all captured from Alaska in 3 separate events, were delivered to Chequasit Bay. And this is where they were relocated to, a place called the Bunsby Islands. And there was 3 translocations. Quite frankly, the first 2 probably didn't do very well. They really didn't know how to handle otters. But during the 3rd translocation, which was 45 animals, they put them in net pens before they released them, and they only put them into the water when they felt that the animals were healthy and well. So we got 45 healthy animals, but at the same time, there was a translocation going on in Washington State. And when otters get released, there's one thing they want to do: swim home. Home was north. So in all likelihood, we also got a whole pile of otters from Washington State. So this is where Linda comes in. Linda is the sea otter biologist for the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. She's responsible for all things otter and works closely with all of that list of people that I gave you. But in particular, Linda is responsible. Okay, that says year across the bottom. This is going to be a huge problem, but never mind. It says year across the bottom. This is the growth of sea otters since that translocation. So sea otters are translocated from 1969 to 1972. They were first counted in 1977. There were 77 otters. It's really easy to remember for me. And since that time, the population has grown. There's about 8,000 otters in British Columbia. Now that probably doesn't sound like a lot to anyone, but for a small carnivore, that is remarkable. It means that at the start, this population was doubling every 4 years. It's now doubling about every, 6 or 7 years, but it's a very, very rapid growth. And we'll talk about why that was rapid in a minute. The other thing they did really well was spread out. And so they extend all the way down to just above Ucluelet. And this map was made in 2017. We can fill all of this area in here now. So they're basically all the way around the top end of Vancouver Island and all up the outer part of the coast to this place right here, which is, my thing's not working very well, Aristazable Island. Okay, so they've grown rapidly and they've spread well. So I just want to point out that I gave you a number, and numbers when it comes to counting otters are probably a little bit iffy. So this is us counting otters, small boat, binoculars. It's a nice calm day, but it often isn't calm. So I want you to tell me how many otters are in that picture, but I want you to go up and down. Size. So what we actually collect is trend data. We count otters in the same manner, same conditions, using the same techniques every time. So we understand the growth rate, but if someone was to tell me there are 10,000 otters or 6,000 otters, I would be hard pressed to argue. Okay, so it's trend data. Okay, I saw Carolyn on the overview there. He's watching. This is for you, Carolyn. I do not work on the same animals as Carolyn does. I work on sea otters, which are kind of river otters' bigger cousins. River otters are a largely terrestrial animal. They certainly in our part of the world go into the water and they feed on fish and they eat crustaceans, but they have up to 4 pups. They den on land. They're quite happy running around on land, pooping on boats and catching frogs. Okay, and they're not that big, about 15 kilograms. Okay, so these are animals that have webbed feet that are adept in the water, but they're just as happy on land. Sea otters are much larger. Sea otters are 40 kilograms. They're the size of a German Shepherd. They are strictly marine. They give birth to 1 offspring every year in the water. They come ashore occasionally, but they usually stick to the intertidal. And the reason for this is they have flipper-shaped hind limbs, and they're great for landing on their back and paddling along. But flippers don't work very well when you go to walk on land. So they're really awkward and move very poorly on land. Okay, they have a single pup. They raise that pup for about 6 months, and then the pup is on its own. The other thing about sea otters is, unlike any other marine mammal, they depend on their fur for keeping them warm. Most marine mammals have a nice layer of blubber that helps to protect the animal from chilly waters. Sea otters depend on fur. They have the thickest fur of any mammal. On its belly, where the fur is thickest, there are 1 million hairs per square inch. Wow. The most hairy of people in this room, I'm going to go to back row, have maybe 10,000 hairs. Okay, so this is really, really thick fur. If you're metric, it's 250,000 hairs per square centimeter. Okay, now in addition to having the fur, and you can look at it, that would be insufficient. But what they do is they blow air into the fur. They keep it really well groomed. The air gets trapped against their body, and their body heats the air up. And that is what provides the insulating layer. Okay, but if you're going to heat air to keep you warm, you're going to need to run your furnace all the time and pretty hot. So these guys have a huge metabolic rate. Put more simply, they eat a lot. A sea otter will eat 25 to 30% of its weight in food each day. The hungriest of teenage boys is on a really, really good day will do 2%. Okay, so this is a phenomenal amount of food. And it turns out that's why sea otters are the forgotten predator. They have an enormous effect because they eat so much. So what do they eat? Sea otters are shellfish vessels. They prey mostly on vertebrates. And we're going to talk a little bit about what they do when they're eating clams, but I'm mostly going to talk about what they do when they eat these things, sea urchins. So sea urchins are obviously spiny. So this is an otter-eyed urchin here. The otter has flipped it over and it's gone in through the oral surface where the spines are shortest. So it doesn't hurt its mouth quite as much. Sea urchins are the lawnmowers of the sea. These guys will mow down anything, and they are basically capable of controlling the abundance and distribution of seaweed. Okay, so seaweed, where there are no otters, occurs in shallow, wave-washed areas where urchins can't possibly graze, or seaweed occurs on unstable habitat substrate, which again, sea urchins can't graze in. So in areas where there are no otters, after 200 years of no otters eating urchins, we get something that is known as an urchin barrens. And this is an area where there are lots of urchins and there is very little seaweed. An urchin this size is probably 200 years old. Okay, they started settling after the otters were removed, and they have been settling ever since then. And for that reason, they are capable of controlling fleshy algae. These are red urchins. Purple urchins can get incredibly abundant. So this is an urchin barrens back here. This doesn't work very well at all. And you can see what these purple urchins have done. When sea otters move into an area, the first thing they do is eat the largest, most obvious prey that they can find, which is often urchins. They very quickly remove all of the urchins, and instead you get these It's pointing down, doesn't like pointing up. You get these huge kelp forests. And I just want to point out that although I've shown you kelp on the top there, if you dive down into that kelp forest, it's just like a real forest. There's another layer of plants underneath. So this is a very complex kelp forest. So what happens when otters move into an area? They eat the urchins and they turn that urchin barrens into a kelp forest. Now you guys all thought that you got come here to hear about sea otters. What I've really done is sucked you all in to tell you all about kelp for the next 5 minutes. So I do need to tell you why kelp matters. So there's two things. I used to just talk about productivity, but nowadays we need to talk about carbon dioxide as well. So kelp increases productivity. It leaks little pieces of kelp into the water that is food for other organs. It creates an entire food web that's based on pieces of kelp, detritus. It leaks, exudates into the water that also makes the water column richer. So I was involved years ago in an experiment where mussels were planted out at Aleutian Islands with otters and lots of kelp, and also planted out at islands without otters and therefore no kelp. We measured the growth rate. The growth rate of the mussels at the islands that had kelp, thus otters, grew 2.5 times faster than the mussels at islands without kelp. And if you ground those mussels up, the kelp, the carbon that they used to grow with came from kelp. So kelp totally increases nearshore productivity. The other thing it does that's really important is it absorbs carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide, of course, is what we're busy pumping into the atmosphere. When it gets picked up by kelp, quite often it gets dumped into the deep ocean where it is functionally sequestered away from the atmosphere. So it's one way of moving carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. The other thing kelp does is it creates habitat. So this is a bunch of juvenile rockfish. You can see them there. All of that structure in the water column increases the habitat complexity. It provides more food for all of those fish. And then finally, something that no one ever thinks about is kelp also changes how water moves. So as water tries to move through a kelp forest, it gets slowed down. And that means that stuff that is in that kelp forest gets entrained and retained. So if something spawns, the larvae will stay within a habitat that is suitable for those larvae. The other thing that it means is if you have a big kelp forest in front of a beach, it's a natural breakwater. And there is a very important theory out there right now. It's called the kelp highway hypothesis. And it suggests that the peopling of North America occurred as maritime peoples traveled along the inside of beautifully sheltered kelp beds, feeding on the bounty that came with that kelp bed. So the kelp was actually the facilitating way of people to get into North America. Okay, so now I'm going to tell you about what actually happens when sea otters move in. So the man that described what happened in the Aleutians, how some islands had sea otters and thus lots of kelp, and some islands had no otters and thus urchins, was a guy named Jim Estes, And I went to California to do a PhD with him. And my job as a PhD student was going to be to try and show that what he had described in Alaska and the Aleutian Islands was also true in British Columbia. So I set out to do a PhD 35 years ago. I finished my PhD. I just kind of got stuck in doing things. So I've been tracking community changes, essentially. I've been interested in what happens when sea otters move into an area and how does that kelp forest change once sea otters are there. And so, again, you can't see all of this, but there are 3 sites there. There's an arrow down the bottom, a middle arrow, and a top arrow. These were places where I set up sites so that I would be able to monitor what areas with otters looked like. I don't understand this. So what areas that already had otters looked like over time. I set up a bunch of sites down here in Barkley Sound where there were no otters. That was to see what areas without otters looked like over time. And then very daringly, I set up a bunch of sites in the middle here. Sea otters would reach them, and I would be able to see what happened when sea otters moved into an area and ate the urchins. And so each one of these sites very quickly is permanently marked. So there's a drill and you put stainless steel pins in. Some of those pins I put in 35 years ago are still there. So each is a swath that's 25 meters long. And then what happens is there's 5 transects off of it. And once a year, a diver goes down, we lay out a tape measure, and then you swim along the tape measure with the meter stick, and you count everything under your meter stick on one side, and you turn around and come back the other way, doing the same thing. So you end up with 5 estimates of kelp and urchins and whatever else there is. So this is Leah doing exactly that. You can't see the tape measure because it's under that banner, but there is a tape measure right there, and there's her counting stick. There's a clipboard, and she's busy counting urchins. Okay, so and I need to point out that urchins are hungry creatures. That tape measure has a life expectancy of about 25 minutes. It's carbon. So see what they've done to that kelp? The tape measures. All my tape measures have leaves outside of them. Okay, so I'm going to show you 3 graphs that look like this. I'm not capable of doing my own income tax, so believe me, there's nothing complicated coming. All these will be the same. It's year across the bottom. And I just figured out why this doesn't work. That's a TV screen. So that's 1987 to 2022. And this is the average number of urchins or brown algae across those 5 swaths. Okay, and each one of those dots is the average. And then the little bar just tells you how much variation there was between those 5 swaths. Lots of variation, the bar is big, not so very much variation, the bar is small. The take-home message here is this is an area without otters. There are lots and lots of urchins, and those urchins have stayed there the whole time. It hasn't been taken over by a kelp forest. An urchin barrens stays as an urchin barrens. Oops.
Sorry, I'm trying to get that out of the way, but it's not working.
Okay, so if we go then to sites that have sea otters at them, and this guy's eating an abalone, it doesn't matter where you go, there's stuff across the top and there's stuff across the top. So we expect at sites with otters that there's going to be lots and lots of kelp. So here we are. And this site, Gull Island, is very near to where sea otters were introduced. So sea otters arrived here in about 1975. There's a lot of chaos going on there. I'm going to come back to it. But this again is year across the bottom and mean number on this axis. I want you to notice the numbers are big. You'll notice there are no urchins to speak of. Gone. And you'll notice that the brown algae goes all crazy here. I finished my PhD in this year. Aren't you happy for me? But this actually is really interesting. I'm not going to have a lot of time to talk about that. Coming back to it. So kelp forests stay as kelp forests, albeit highly variable, but they stay as kelp forests. So what happens when an otter arrives? So this is the best sign we have. Searching for sequel. Sometimes people told me that otters were doing my science for me. I didn't mind. I just needed otters to come. I'm only going to show you one of those sites. And this is Union Island. We set it up. It was an urchin barrens, about 100 urchins per swath. We went back in 1989. There might have been 150 urchins per swath. And then in the spring of 1990, 120 male otters took up residence right over top of this site. And when we sampled it in July, there were no urchins and there were about 300 bull kelp plants per swath. It was like swimming in a field of spaghetti. And over time, that bull kelp has disappeared because just like in a terrestrial forest, it's been replaced by long live perennial species. It goes from an initial stage to an old growth successional stage. That's pretty much what you're looking at here. But you'll notice once the otters came in and took the urchins, it has stayed. Okay, so we have urchin barrens and we have kelp forests, and otters can turn an urchin barrens into a kelp forest. Okay, so switch speeds now. I want to talk about some of the work that Erin did. Erin did her PhD at UVic, and she's really interested in what sea otters do in soft substrate environments. Okay, about 60 to 90% of an otter's diet is actually clams. And so she said, what happens when otters dig? That's a lot. And so that's exactly what she set out to look at. And in particular, and this is something that had been bugging me for years, was what happens when otters dig in eelgrass? For those of you who work on this coast, eelgrass is the sacred cow. Thou shalt not disturb the eelgrass. Well, unfortunately, the otters didn't read the habitat warnings, and they ripped the stuff up. This is a hole dug by an otter. It's about 1.5 meters wide, and those are all the clams it's been going after. So Aaron said, what's with that? How come the eelgrass looks so good? And so it turns out there's some really cool stuff about eelgrass. So eelgrass has 2 ways it can reproduce. It can just clone itself by roots and shoots. And if the world is good and everything's staying the same, why change? What the eelgrass is doing works. So you just clone yourself. You just keep producing more identical plants by roots and shoots. However, and so that's this down here, this is asexual reproduction. However, if the world starts to change, someone comes in and starts digging you up, the world is changing and the way you are might not work. So you want to hedge your bets. And in this case, sea eelgrass can switch to sexual reproduction. It makes a flower. And pollen from another distant eelgrass plant fertilizes that flower. It produces seeds, which have the genes from the mother and the genes from the father. That's called genetic diversity. And all of those seeds are going to be slightly different. And those seeds are hopefully, 1 or 2 of those seeds are going to be suited for environmental conditions of the future. Okay, so if the world is stable, just keep chunking out yourself. The world is changing, get sexy, and make seeds. So Aaron made a prediction that as sea otter digging went up, that the eelgrass gets more and more disturbed. The amount of seeds they produce should go up. And if they're producing more seeds, eelgrass meadows that have been subjected to lots of otter digging should be more genetically diverse. Sea otter should be good for eelgrass meadows. And so she set out to try and show that. And what she did was she compared eelgrass beds among a range of different sea otter occupants. So she went to beds, eelgrass meadows where sea otters were long established, more than 30 years. She went to eelgrass meadows where sea otters have been for up to 10 years. And she went to seagrass meadows where sea otters were absent. And what she predicted was that the genetic diversity of seagrass meadows at sites with lots of otters for a long time should be more genetically diverse. Okay, how many of you guys remember your grade 12 genetics? Ooh. Okay, so this is a simple graph, and I'm going to explain it to you. So across the bottom is number of samples, and I want you to notice that those lines go up and level off. When you're sampling something like genes, you want to make sure that you've sampled enough plants that you have captured the range of genetic diversity from that site, right? Because those lines could go up forever. So the number of samples is just telling us when those lines level out, got enough. On this axis, we have the number of alleles. Yes. So I want you to imagine for a moment, and I'm lying a little bit, this hair color is a little more complicated than this, but I want you to imagine that somewhere in your genome, and this is true, you have a little gene that says what color your hair is going to be. That's the gene for hair color. You could have the allele for brown hair. You could have the allele for blonde hair. You could have the allele for red hair. Those are alleles. Alleles are just different versions of the same gene. Okay? That good for everyone? That's not how hair color works, but this is the best story I can come up with. Okay, so all you need to notice here is you'll notice that the blue lines, which are where there are no sea otters or sea otters have only recently arrived, they have less alleles, less sex, less mixing, less switching it up. Whereas where sea otters have been for 30 years or more, there are more alleles. So this demonstrates that sea otters are actually increasing the genetic diversity of seagrass beds, of eelgrass meadows. And what that means is it means that into the future, these eelgrass meadows are going to be more able to resist some of the nasty diseases and climate change effects they're looking at. So sea otters are good for seagrass. Okay, this is Ed Greger's work now. And Ed is a modeler, he's a math head, he's also a biologist and natural historian. And he was really interested in how all of these interactions that sea otters make, and there's a lot of them, how does that play out into the human realm? And so he wanted to take each one of those little ecological interactions all the way from plankton right up to fish and turn them into dollars. He wanted to tell us how valuable all of those ecological interactions that sea otters make are. And he had good reason for wanting to do this, because although I'm telling you all the wonderful things sea otters do, there are a lot of things that sea otters do that people really don't like. They compete very effectively with human beings for shellfish resources. So the geoduck fishery in 2016 was worth $31 million wholesale. The crab fishery was worth $80 million wholesale. Red urchins were worth 18 million, and clams were worth 8 million. Sea otters love all of those things, and they're better at getting them than humans are. So what Ed did was he said, okay, so we know some of these costs. Can we try using all these ecological interactions, and yourself what we did here? Can we turn that into value? And he did. Again, this is another graph, but it's actually a pretty simple graph. It's called a violin plot. I love the name. So this is the zero. This is the zero line right here. Okay. So that zero line, everything above that is a gain. Everything below it is a loss. Okay. Violin plots are very simple. The longer they are, the more uncertain we are about the range of values that they can occupy. But where they are fattest, that's what it is. Okay. Isn't that pretty simple, I think? So we have four things he looked at here. The direct catch of geoducks. He predicts that compared to an otter-free world, the geoduck fishermen are going to lose at least $10 million a year. Okay, that's a net cost. I'm just going to give you these ones. Supplemental catch, that's fish. So I told you that fish increase in kelp forests. Lots of fish, the bigger fish, do well in kelp forests. So he predicted that the amount of fish that gets caught is going to go up. And you'll notice a very long, very uncertain at the top there, but there's a fair predictability that it's probably going to be worth about $10 million more. And then he did carbon, and carbon's pretty hilarious. Carbon, who cares about carbon? Every time you fly on a plane, you get given the option of buying a carbon offset. Carbon is worth something now. So all that carbon that's being sequestered by kelp is technically worth something. And I predict in the future that you're going to see people who are being subjected to sea otter foraging selling carbon offsets. And he predicted that was going to be worth between $3 and $5 million. And then tourism, which has the greatest uncertainty, is probably going to increase the economy by 40 million. So he predicted that there would be losses to the shellfish, perhaps gains in other areas. And the one big caveat that was in this paper was this was for commercial exploitation. It doesn't consider loss of traditional resources to indigenous communities. They can't just relocate their waivers. Okay, still on time. So I can't not talk about kelp and climate change. I never thought in my lifetime I would be talking about climate change, but I have to. So I showed you all of that chaos in that Belt Island graph. Some of that is just because of natural selection, natural processes. But some of it is the world is changing. And usually kelp forests are predictable. You get annual species, they're replaced by perennial species, and then the whole thing sort of cycles over again. But of recent, that has really started to change. And this is where Mike Hawks and I and two other people teamed up a few years back to look at a species called, that's a southern sea palm up the top there. I'm going to call it Izinea, that's its Latin name. And Izenia is this plant in the background here. It has a stalk, a stipe, and it's got two little ears that turn over and then a whole bunch of beautiful frilly blades. And it has a really patchy distribution. And by patchy, I mean it's really common in Southern California. There is no Izenia between California and or Washington State. It's 1,000 kilometers where there's no Izenia. Then you get to BC and there's little pockets of it. Haida Gwaii was the farthest north pocket we knew about. We found a few more in our study. But what Mike proposed and spent a lot of time looking into was what we were looking at is a plant that had been shuffled to the south and to places that were ice-free in the north during the Pleistocene glaciation. And so what we're looking at now is southern kelp slowly repopulating as it moves north, and Izenia coming out of wherever this little ice-free refugium was and repopulating British Columbia. But the cool thing when you think about that is it means you have a species that does really well in Baja California, but also did well in Pleistocene glaciation. So this is a species that probably does cold and hot really well. And so the southern sea palm, there's a few things I need to tell you about it. It's long-lived, 10 years. It's pretty good in warm water. It's pretty good in cool water. The key here is that it reproduces during the summer months. And if you look at this white spot on this blade here, that's a blade that has released its spores. The spores settle down, bit of a complicated life cycle. We don't need to worry about it. And eventually they give rise to these little baby sporophytes here, which are going to grow up and produce that big plant there. And the cool thing about this plant is those spores are still viable even if the water temperature is over 18 degrees Celsius. And I have seen over 18 degrees Celsius in Chesapeake Bay in the last 2 years. Okay, so the other ones, I've spent a lot of time working on this. It's called old growth kelp, and it's called old growth kelp, my name, because it is the old growth forest of the area I work in. And you can cut these guys down. I hate doing it, but I've done it a lot. And you can actually count the rings that they lay down in their sites, how I come to know how old they are. Izenia does the same thing. So it's really long lived, lives up to about 20 years. It goes as far as Southern California, but not so much into Baja. So it tolerates warm water, but not as warm as Izenia. It goes further north than Izenia, so it's probably better at cold water. This guy reproduces in the winter. And its strategy was to set its spores during winter storms when the storms are ripping up other seaweed plants and there's space on the seabed for its flores to settle and grow. Okay, so that's its strategy. It doesn't like really warm water though. Its spores are not alive when it's greater than 18 degrees. Okay, one more graph. No, there's one after this. Okay, so this is Gull Island again. You've seen this graph, but what I've done instead is break it down into the southern sea palm and old growth kelp. And so I started this work way back then, and literally what happens is otters come in, eat the urchins, the kelp grows in a flush. You get a really dense forest, and over time, it thins itself out and plants age and die. So that's what this decline is. And then space happens, spores settle, the whole thing resets itself, and you get this sort of cycle. Now, these guys only reproduce in the winter, the red, the old growth kelp. And you will notice that there was no Izenia at this site until the early 2000s. And it started to get pretty warm then. And what happened is all of a sudden, the pteridoptera started to fall down in the summer months. It's too hot. That creates space on the seafloor during the summer months. Who's reproductive during the summer? Izenia. So the Izenia spores settle down, take up the space that pteridoptera might otherwise have occupied that winter. And if you look at what happened, this Izenia has been steadily increasing. As of 2020, it has become the dominant site at Gull Island. Now, this is a native kelp. This is just climate change. This is the type of thing we're going to see across our landscape with species distribution and abundances, relative abundances changing. because the environment we live in is changing. Okay, that's one site. So maybe it's not true. So I have 40 sites that I sample about every 7 to 10 years, depending on my funding and how I'm feeling. And so this is the year across the bottom. I sampled those sites at 1988 through 2019. They've been sampled 5 times. In 1988, there was no Eisenia sites. The red bar is the percentage of sites that had Eisenia at it. So in 1994, 7 of the 40 sites had it. In 2007, 10 of the sites, 2013, 8 of the sites, and in 2019, 18 of those 40 sites, 48% of those sites had Eisenia. And these little blobs are just tracking increase in density. So more sites have Eisenia, and the abundance of Eisenia is going up. So Eisenia thrives in warm water. That's likely to increase. So this is just one example, I think, of the types of changes that we're likely to see. Okay, one last slide and it's not a wrap. Okay, I cannot go away from talking about sea otters and kelp without talking about this guy. And this guy is a Sirenian, the biggest Sirenian to ever live. Sirenians are dugongs and manatees. They're tropical animals. They live in places like Florida and northern Australia, and they eat seagrass. That's what they do. This guy lived in the North Pacific. It lived during the Pleistocene from northern Japan all the way down to California. It was 10 meters long, and it weighed between 9 and 10 tons. It was a herbivore. What do you suppose it ate? Kelp. This guy ate kelp. It was the only dugong to eat kelp. And it would have been a Pleistocene creature. Humans arrived just after the Pleistocene, and this was a guy that probably didn't do that well under human hunting. Although it's probably also not an animal that was well adapted to warm waters. So with the arrival of people as the ice retreated and warming as the ice retreated, the stellar sea kelp probably started to decline. The last place we know the stellar sea kelp to have been was on the Commander Islands, which is the last group of islands between the Aleutian Islands and the Kamchatka Peninsula. And George Wilhelm Steller, who was a naturalist traveling with Vidius Bering, was a Norwegian captain that the Russians had hired to find out whether North America and Russia were connected. They got shipwrecked on the Commander Islands in 1741. Everyone was miserable, save for one person, George Wilhelm Steller, who ran around collecting plants, making observations, cutting things up, and being naturalist. He had a fantastic time. And then they managed to build boats and sail off back to the Kamchatka Peninsula, but not before George Wilhelm Steller had described in detail Steller's sea kelp. 1741, he described it. These sailors arrived back in Russia. Steller's journals were published. 2 things came out of that. There are sea otters in the Aleutian Islands. Go get them. And why you're going to get those sea otters, there's 10 tons of meat at a package sitting on the Commander Islands. So Russian fur traders left the Kamchatka Peninsula, stopped at the Commander Islands, loaded up on meat, and went and caught sea otters. Described in 1741, this creature was extinct in 1768. And so we'll never know what the stellar sea kelp did, but it ate the kelp that the otters made. And you have to talk about the stellar sea kelp. This little picture up top is one is a mimicking from Steller's drawings, but I just put it up there. Scale. Those are people trying to measure and cut up a stellar sea kelp. So I've done a lot of I and me and I, and obviously this is not me and I work. This is a cast of thousands. And over 35 years, I've had an enormous number of people work with me, and it's just a selection, but there's a few people I need to point out. This is Leah up in the corner here, and Gina down here. I've been going out 35 years. I bet you they've both been there for 30 of those 35 years. They are great friends and stalwart companions. That's Aaron, who you've heard about. This guy in the middle is Graham, who just has to put up with this, whether or not. And then these people down here, the Chidley family, Frank and Sue and Rick. I just wanted to say something about changing times. You guys probably noticed there was data collected in 2019, 2020, and 2021. I am one of the lucky biologists. A lot of people's long-term data sets went to hell in a handbasket, as they say, because people couldn't sample while COVID was going on. Frank and Sue agreed to put me and my entourage up, which is scuba tanks, wets, dry suits, wet stuff, compressors, boats. It's a mess here. They agreed to put us up, and the Cayuga First Nations said that if we weren't mixing with people, we were welcome to come. So it was because of them that I was and the Cayuga First Nations, obviously, that we were able to continue our work. So they've been friends for a long time, but I just wanted to acknowledge that sometimes exceptional times require exceptional circumstances. So obviously also people have been generous in their funding and support. And I'd like to point out that I work in a called Cayuga. It's a mixture of people of European ancestry and the Checoslovakian and Cayuga First Nations. And people have been over the years incredibly supportive of this autobiologist they thought was only going to be there for 4 or 5 years. He keeps coming back. So I'd like to acknowledge all of them. And that's it. More grass and more kelp than expected.
And I have 2 questions. Okay, one is what people using the otter skins for?
Oh, the otter skins? Well,
Jane, Can I get you to repeat the questions for people
Okay,
on Zoom?
so-
Thanks.
So First Nations use those otter skins according to ethnography, mostly as regalia. And certainly on the West Coast where I work, they were considered otter garments were considered cheap the robes. Some people ate them and others didn't. The Tlingit didn't, the Papalia did. But for the most part, I think they were harvested for their fur, teeth. You find the teeth as healing and things like that. So, but mostly their fur.
Okay. During COVID, and it may be Peter and I used to go and have coffee outside. We would notice that in coming around the lighthouse, almost every day, I swear, there was long eelgrass rafts that would come circling around the lighthouse and just travel all the way into the harbor and sort of disappear, right?
So Aaron, this would be Aaron to talk about this, but there's a whole pile of things that probably disturb eelgrass and probably play an important role. First Nations used to harvest the roots. They actually stuck a pole down and they would twist it and then pull the roots up, the rhizomes, and they would be roasted and eaten. So they probably played a role in disturbing eelgrass. Geese love seagrass. So in the summer, when the tide's low in the day, geese are out there eating the eelgrass, and I think a lot of it is getting disrupted, and that's probably what you're seeing drifting by. But those types of disturbance are probably promoting genetic diversity in this is so one of those unthought of things.
Thank you.
I've got 2 kelp questions.
Okay, I'm good at kelp.
One is the bull kelp with
Yeah.
the stem and the float and the wavy leaves. Is that all one species or are there several different?
So the one that has a single stalk that comes up from the bulb on the top and the blades, that's bull kelp. It's one species. That's the fastest growing photosynthetic organism in the world. Grows 8 centimeters a day. Because it's an annual.
How many a day?
That's
1 year.
question.
8 centimeters a day, up to 8 a day.
Instead of in the winter.
They get cast ashore or they sink and get swept out to deeper water. And that's where carbon is removed from the atmosphere and put into deep water where it doesn't get back into the atmosphere for thousands of years. That's how kelp can help with carbon sequestration.
But how then, does the next sequence come?
So the blades have little sori, it's called spores, and those spores get released, they settle to the bottom. And then they can, if the light is low, which is literally how it works, during the winter, when there's no light, it doesn't grow, and then I always like to say on February 14th, when the sun comes down, it produces eggs and sperm, or the spores, either male or female spores produce eggs or sperm, and then you get the next crop of bull kelp.
And that can grow 80 feet in.
It can go about 10 meters, yeah, it'll grow 10 meters in a season quite happily, and in places like California, long, taller and faster. Yeah, no, it's very productive, very, very productive.
So, otter question. So river otters and sea otters, are they in conflict? Are they complementary?
I don't think they get in the way of each other at all. I mean, they eat some of the same food, but river otters are quite adept at eating terrestrial organisms, frogs, salamanders. They'll go into a pond and eat fish. I'm sure most of you know that, probably have had the experience. So I think they have a terrestrial, I think Carolyn should be answering this. They have a terrestrial source of food as well as, in our case, a marine source. Sea otters need to eat more. So quite frankly, if there was ever to be serious competition between river otters and sea otters, it's sea otters hands down. But I see sea otters where there are river otters and vice versa.
And so another question, quite a great topic, stellar sea cow.
Yeah.
Same person who named stellar sea lion.
Stellar sea lion, Stellar's jay.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
So when he arrived, are we about telestreams?
Oh, cool.
Over time, when Stellar arrived in North America, Bering had 2 ships and they sailed through the Aleutians. The ships became separated, unfortunately. And the ship that Bering and Stellar were on arrived in, they didn't know where they were, maybe North America. And it was Stellar that was able to tell Bering that they were in North America because blue-crested birds. And he had read about blue-crested birds on the eastern side of the North American continent in records from naturalists that had worked over there. So it bears his name, but it's also what let them know they were now on continental North America. So Stellar's, yeah, and Stellar's sea cow, Stellar's sea lion, yeah. I think that's all of the Stellar. No, there's some fish.
The sea otters didn't make it into the Strait of Georgia, or did they?
Probably. There were so many people living in the Strait of Georgia that I suspect that they would have been extricated just by the sheer volume of people that were here. The number of sea otters that there were and where they were is a source of great speculation, if you like. There's no reason why sea otters would not have been in the Strait of Georgia, but sea otters and human beings compete for resources big time. So, you know, where I work in Chesapeake Bay, there's, let's say, 1,300 sea otters. There's no way 1,300 sea otters could have lived there if there was also 5,000 people eating the same resources of those sea otters. So, you know, there would have been competition between humans and sea otters. Sea otters would also have been hunted by First Nations. And I think in areas like the Strait of Georgia, where the hunting would have been relatively easy, there would have been few places that otters would have escaped humans over, you know, the 15,000 years of occupation or whatever the Strait of Georgia is. Most of the sea otter remains, if they occur, are likely to be in middens that in some cases are submerged. So, but there's absolutely no reason why they wouldn't be here. There is at this point in time no record for being in the Strait of Georgia. That's probably just a matter of time.
So we're not likely to see sea otters here.
You can see sea otters here. Graham and I were, I mean, they show up periodically, but Graham and I were out 2 falls ago, and we were out on Marina Island, which is just off Cortez. And it's so funny because we're coming back sailboat in our little boat, and an animal porpoised ahead of me, and a couple of sea otters just carried on going. Until about 15 seconds later, I went, no, Jake, sea otter, wrong place, wrong one. And Randy said, yeah, that was sea otter. So they are here. There was one. Oh yeah, Wayne Bory saw one in Nanaimo Harbor. So, but those are males. They're the males. I guess I could have if I'm still talking. I didn't want to spend too much time on the details you all wanted to hear about. Not that I wanted to talk about. So sea otters segregate by gender. So the females all hang out together, the males all hang out together. And then the males that are sexually and physically mature, like socially mature, move away from the male raft and set up territories where the females are when the females come into season, usually in the autumn. So all those young males, they don't stand a chance of finding a place to get females. So they go walkabout, hoping they will magically find a place where there's a bunch of unknown female otters. And so all these stray animals we see scattered around are almost certainly males that have just gone walkabout and lost. I don't know, they're probably doing quite well. They just don't have any females, but lots of food. Yeah. Yeah, there's been one around Middle Match, there's one at the sea, yeah, they're singles.
What's their age expectancy?
So in captivity, they live to be about 15 years. So it may be slightly younger than that in the wild, and the female will have a pup every single year from about age 3 to 5 onwards. And they often lose their first pup, but they're exceptionally good mothers. So once they've been a mom once, usually they will raise a pup to weaning, which is one of the reasons the population has grown so quickly. It grew quickly for 2 reasons. Sea otters are good moms. And the second reason is there was lots of food, because in 200 years of no otters, and all of a sudden there's all these resources that were probably controlled largely by.
Do females secrete anything that would let male otters find them?
No, they know the females all hang out predictably in the same location. The males know where the females are. And when the female weans her pup, she goes into estrus. And so that's when the male will form a brief consortship with her, about 4 or 5 days at most. He will mate with her. And then sea otters, like a lot of marine mammals, undergo something called delayed implantation, which means the egg gets fertilized, but instead of it sits in suspended animation before it carries on its development. And the reason for that is that you ideally in a harsh environment want to have your pup at a good time of the year. So ideally that would mean you have it in the spring. Or if you're something like a fur seal that has an 8-month gestation period, but you're only going to the Pribilof Islands once a year, you can imagine if you had to go every 8 months, it would get completely out of cycle, right? So by having that delayed implantation, it keeps the cycle predictable and regular. So they don't need to put anything out. Males gather right away there.
Are they still protected?
Sea otters are technically something that is called special concern, which this is under CWIC right now. They were under SARA. It's waiting for the next SARA approval or not. And under special concern, a species is given no special protection beyond what the Fisheries Act provides, which is thou shalt not harass or bug marine mammals. So in that way, they're protected, but they're not protected under SARA in any special way. Special concern is a status that is given to species that are subject to human disturbance and are threatened by human disturbance. And in the case of sea otters, with that fur that they have to keep clean, oil spills are a huge risk for sea otters. So they are at present, because the range of otters is relatively limited. One big oil spill is to hideous damage. So but it doesn't, it's not special protection.
Has there been any controversy with the rise in otter population?
A little here and there, yeah. No, sea otters are not, depending on who you are, not well liked. I mean, the geoduck harvesters, obviously, urchin harvesters, their livelihoods are threatened. And I would also point out, I mean, it's a really complicated story, because the geoduck fishery and the urchin fishery are 2 fisheries that probably couldn't ever have been were it not for the extirpation of sea otters. Geoducks, when they started harvesting them in about 1972, the average age of the geoducks they were harvesting was 142 years old. To do the math, that's back to 1850. when sea otters were functionally eradicated. They were no longer ecologically important. Urchins, an 18 centimeter urchin, 180 millimeter urchin is 180 years old. And again, those are urchins that probably recruited right after sea otters were hunted in the sea otter fur trade.
Who eats the urchin?
Pardon, who eats sea urchins? The roe is very, very valuable in Asia. So, yeah. And that's where the breed go to. They're mostly going to Asian markets. Clams we eat, and crabs we eat. Yeah, but those are really valuable fisheries, obviously, and coastal communities depend on them. And First Nations, of course, we don't know what it looked like 200 years ago, but in all likelihood, with all of those people, there were probably, sea otters were probably distributed in a very different manner. If you're an animal that's being hunted by a group of people, you're not going to hang out in your backyard. You're probably going to keep yourself away from village sites. So the distribution would have been really different. So much of this controversy is a product of modern times and our not knowing what the world looked like 300 years ago. So, but yes, there's lots of controversy. I'm sorry if I didn't make that clear.
Emily, I have questions on chat.
Nope, just some thanks. Nancy Turner, thank you so much, Jane. Just fascinating, beautiful presentation. And Elizabeth Miller, fascinating and informative talk. Thank you very much. Made me think about a lot of important things.
There'll be a short quiz on wheels.
So, you know, down in the Berkeley area back in the 70s, I guess, there was a lot of sea otters down there at that time. But there was also a lot of abalone.
So yeah, spent quite a bit of time dealing with abalone and otters. So north of about Fort Russ, there's no otters. Actually, south of there, Fort Bragg, there's no otters, and that's where most of the red abalone. There's a fish snorkel only fishery for them. Santa Cruz South, there's still lots of abalone, but the fishery depleted those abalone severely, even in areas south of Point Conception where there's no otters. Those fisheries are all toast, and they're toast by overfishing and disease and things like that. But there are still lots of abalone in areas where sea otters are. They're in crevices, and abalone are a great story about kelp, because if there's lots of kelp, an abalone can make a living in a crevice because it sits there in the crevice. The pieces of kelp rain down on top of it. It doesn't have to leave the crevice. It's getting tons of food. So it doesn't have to come out of the crevice and get eaten by an otter while it's looking for food. There'll be 5 or 6 abalone jammed in that crevice. So when it comes time to spawn, there they all are, nice and close together, boy, girl, boy, girl, boy, girl. They spawn. They have great fertilization success. Those larvae come out of the crevice. What are they in? A kelp forest. What do kelp forests do? They stop water flow. So 12 days later, that larvae has to settle down. It's in a kelp forest where it's meant to be in the first place. There's not very many predators to eat it because the otters have already crabs and things like that. So its survival would be greater. That's not to say there will be enough abalone to support a commercial fishery, but there's certainly lots of abalone in the system. So it's just different than we have come to expect hyperabundance, I think, because in many cases the absence of predators. The forgotten predator.
And one more quick question.
Yeah.
Do they sleep on their backs in the water?
Yeah, they do. Yeah, and they sort of wrap themselves up in kelp if there's kelp so they don't blow away. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, and there's pelts if anyone wants to see this, and I didn't talk about otters and river otters that much, but so sea otters have really flat teeth because they're crushing, right? So unidont dentition it's called, whereas there's a river otter. And it's got really sharp shearing teeth because it's ripping fish apart. So completely different. And that sort of gives you an idea about the size difference. And then there's pelts here. There's 2 sea otter pelts. So just to give you an idea, that's a sea otter. And then so birds. And so one of these is a male otter, shot in the summer and one is a female otter that died in the winter, actually feel the difference in their fur, which always surprises me. There you go.
Thank you
Very
so
good.
much.
Thank you.
Yes.